Good evening, everyone, and thank you. Thank you for joining me for this evening's Look into the Holy Book Devotional, and I am your host, Charles Logan. I apologize for last week. I have no idea what happened, and I am always a little bit afraid that something's going to go wrong because I'm certainly not an expert on these computers. But thank you once again for your patience and for joining me. Um, Tonight, I want to talk about having to give things up, things that we like to do, things that we don't want to give up. Have you ever had to give up something that you really, really like to do? Maybe you had been doing that thing for quite a long time, but circumstances were just such that you just couldn't continue with it. Did you feel sad? Or maybe you felt self-imposed guilt for quitting. I shared last week that I've had to give up some of my ministries and some that I'd been involved in for a number of years, and I was struggling with that. You know, this evening the title of our devotional is When It's Time to Step Aside. Some years ago, that's probably about 25 years ago now, my wife and I were attending a non-denominational church in Tucson. We had attended there for several years, and I had become very much involved in several of the ministries there. We were comfortable with the Bible teaching and their statement of faith. It was very similar to my Southern Baptist tradition, things that I'd been brought up with all my life. It was a time that I held a very high level of respect for our senior pastor, someone who had been preaching there for much longer than my wife and I had been attending there. And I have to admit, I was brought up in a place where we had a very high level of admiration for our pastors, even placing them on an imaginary pedestal, believing deep inside that they were not only very specially called men of God, but lived an exemplary life devoted to family and their church, and holding a moral standard that would be envious of anyone. Then one day, my image of that individual that I had always placed on a level above any other man, that image was shattered. The man who I had always respected and even placed on that imaginary pedestal caused me to reevaluate all that I had perceived as exemplary in a shepherd of the flock, a leader of the church, the infallible individual, especially called by God. I found out that he was a man like any other man, subject to the same temptations and failures and mistakes as anyone else. On that Sunday, a day that will always mark my change in perception of reality, our beloved pastor confessed from the pulpit that he and his wife were separated and that they were getting a divorce. In my mind, his wife was the epitome of a pastor's wife. Supportive, a leader in women's ministry in the church, and a devoted mother to their children, one of which was handicapped. We were all left dumbfounded, and I was in particular, having held that shining perception of a man that was the perfect example of a godly man. The second blow came a few weeks later when he said that he was leaving the ministry and the leadership of the church, that he had been his life for many years. He admitted in genuine sincerity that he had put a priority on his ministry and his life outside the church. He was an avid outdoorsman and a hunter, and he had neglected his family, knowing that his marriage was irreconcilably broken. He felt that he could no longer uphold the biblical requirements for being an elder and a church leader. From that time on, I had to reconcile my ideal of what a pastor was and realize that he was a man called by God, certainly, but also a man subject to all the failures of any man. It was also very difficult for me to understand how he could give up a calling that was really a special spiritual gift, and in my perception, a lifelong commitment to serve God. Well, as I said, this was many years ago, and I believe that I have matured spiritually enough to understand that sometimes one has a very good reason to step aside from ministry. As you know, the Bible is full of passages that encourage and preach the message of persevering, having the wherewithal to go forward with strength and dedication, unswerving in a commitment to serve God or the church that Jesus Christ established on this earth. When we get tired, we go to verses like Philippians 4:12 to 13, in which Paul is encouraging the church in Philippi using his own experiences as an example. He writes, "I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound in any circumstance. I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, dependence and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me." Psalm 21:34 says, that reminds us to be strong and let your heart take courage, all you who wait on the Lord. When we committed our lives to Christ, at that moment we acknowledged that to follow him was also a commitment to suffer with him. Our lives from that point on would be filled with good times, but also times when we would need strength and encouragement to press onward. What we hoped for was, at the end, we would be spoken of as living a life as a good and faithful servant. Now, there are so many things that we face during our lifetimes that require the strength of the Lord, for only he can bring us out of deep emotional despair with his love and his encouragement. For example, are the words from James 1:12. "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." But as you know, it's not always something that we can persevere in. And the Bible is mostly silent on encouragement for those who find that they, for some various and even sometimes noble reasons, must step aside. Now, mind you, some of the things that I will be sharing this evening will apply to just about any endeavor in life, although I will be focusing on ministry in particular. Now, I think back to that time many years ago when my idea of a pastor was so drastically changed, and I might add, for the better. We don't live in a magical world where our glowing perceptions are always just the way that we want. We live in a world where we must look at things realistically. We may have our ideas about how we want things to be, but we also have to look at things like they really are. We will never be able to survive or contribute positively in our own fantasy world. Oh, that's not to say that there are people out there who refuse to see or accept the world as it is, and sometimes that leads to tragic results. When I wanted to be able to find scriptural confirmation of valid reasons for stepping aside in ministry, and perhaps one example would be when a very tired King David stepped aside and handed all authority to Solomon. In a moment I'll share some fundamental and I would say some very good reasons to do so. Now, one of the people who I have always respected and looked up to as the quintessential minister is Billy Graham. You know, I grew up with Billy Graham's crusades and live television broadcasts. I really never gave it much thought. In my mind, he had always been there. I never thought he would get old because he always was perpetually young and energetic in my mind. But even as much as of a godly man and servant to ministry that he was, even he reached a point where he had to step aside. And for very valid reasons. He held his last of his large crusades in 2005 when he was 86 years old. Although he really never gave up his personal ministry, yet he stepped aside and turned everything over to his son, Franklin Graham. He never lost his motivation for ministry, but he was slowed down by age and injuries and illnesses, wherein he did not feel that he could be as effective anymore. Most of us, though, are not like Billy Graham. When we think about giving up our ministries, we naturally sometimes feel a sense of guilt in a way because we never thought of giving up or turning the ministries over to somebody else. We envisioned ourselves ministering to the very last, going to sleep and waking up in heaven. But once again, we live in a real world with real people, real problems, real illnesses, and time passes relentlessly, counting each year as we get older. You know, last week I passed my assisted living home Bible ministry to one of our assistant pastors. It was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. I had been contemplating this for quite some time, and especially since I reached that golden milestone in years. Even though I had been ministering there for 13 or 14 years, I went through a roller coaster of emotions, from guilt to feeling I was giving up. When I thought long and hard and through prayerful contemplation, I realized that I no longer had the energy and the motivation to continue. I felt that the study needed a fresh face and new ideas. I do believe that someone in a particular ministry can get stale, and those being ministered to can get bored and lose their interest. And that is the last thing that I wanted to happen. So last week, I stepped aside. You know, I realize this is a situation that has presented itself to those in ministry long before I struggled with it. Good, godly individuals have been facing this moment long before I ever did. So there is no guilt that should be attached to this decision, especially when you consider that places must be made available and spiritual gifts must be exercised by someone, just like someone stepped aside to make room for me. In my research, I found some very valid reasons for stepping aside from ministry, reasons that should hold no regret or shame for coming to that decision. The first one would be, as my former pastor concluded, he no longer felt that he qualified biblically for that position of church leadership. He felt strongly that he could not in good conscience fulfill the spiritual needs of his congregation and be an example to his flock as a divorced man. Now there are other options on this, but I respected his decision and I understood it even these years later. Being a minister of the gospel does not exempt someone from being crushed by work. There are some very qualified church leaders who suffer burnout. It is so easy to devote so much time to ministry that it not only becomes a hardship on the family, but overwork, taking on others' problems, being available all of the time, and suffering a lack of encouragement from a mentor can all add up to becoming overloaded physically and emotionally. And that ministry loses luster and appeal. The decision is usually irreversible, and we have lost another good minister to burnout. Not all of the reasons for stepping aside in ministry are negative ones, though. Sometimes someone feels called by God to make a change. Perhaps there is a calling to become a missionary, leaving the relative comfort of an established job and regular income is sometimes overcome by a strong calling to serve the Lord in a different way. Lottie Moon was one such individual. She left the comfort and security of a teaching job to become a full-time missionary in China. She devoted so much energy to her ministry that, physically exhausted and sickly, she died on board ship returning to the United States in 1912. Sometimes a godly person and dedicated servant just becomes mentally and physically tired, exhausted, whether because of age or loss of strength, because of illness, and the energy and motivation is just no longer there. There's really no desire to leave the ministry. There's just a natural slowing down and loss of the ability to persevere that overtakes your desire to carry on. Now, I've come to the conclusion that there is no shame in stepping aside from ministry, if the reasons are to take a well-deserved rest from an endeavor well done, if the reasons are to, well, sometimes for all of us, whether we want to or not, God expects us to serve him. Even he rested on the seventh day of creation and looked around at his work, and he said that it was good. I know that someday I will have to let go of this ministry, but Lord willing, it will not be soon. So I guess I have to admit that I have ministry in, and I have enjoyed what I have done. But I've had to realize that I have my physical limitations too. The words in Exodus 33:14 kind of sums up all that we've talked about this evening. The Lord replied, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Well, faithful followers and listeners, thank you very much for joining me again this evening. And I hope there won't be any glitches, and this recording will get out to all of you. So once again, I thank you for your loyalty, and as your host, Charles Logan, I wish you all a very good evening and the week to come, until, Lord willing, we can get together again next Thursday for the Look into the Holy Book devotional. Until then, I will say good evening.